So, who are you?
Okay, so I'm Gerd Leonhard, futurist and CEO of the Futures Agency. I've been a futurist for 15 years, and I help companies and governments and people to understand what's coming in the next 10 years.
You've
And
just written a book,
yes, my name is
Technology versus Humanity.
yeah. So this is an important book, but for me because I've been doing lots of work with technology companies for the last 12 years, 15 years, and now the major question that's emerging is how far do we go with technology? And what do we do when technology becomes better, quicker, faster, more has more capacity than our own brain, than ourselves, which is going to happen in roughly 7 years. And then we have to cross that bridge to figure out if technology and humanity are converging or not.
What do you think are the biggest threats that technology brings? The exponential growth of technologies.
Well, I would say that there's many good things that to say that first, right? So there are lots of threats, but there's also thousands of great things, right? Like, for example, the possibility of solving global warming, of creating enough water, everyone of the feed cancer, and so on, right? That's all good stuff. But then there's hundreds of small things that are really small today. For example, application, which means you give control to technology that you should actually do yourself. And this happens, for example, in online dating, right? It happens in when you order stuff. It happens in e-commerce. And so what's happening right now is that computers are getting so intelligent that they are essentially replicating ourselves in the cloud. So it's not just the mobile device. It's now the what I call the global brain, right? It's the every system has a giant database of who I am, and they can copy me, including my thinking, and predict what I do, right? So this includes privacy risks and identity theft and addiction, of course, and a slew of things. Most of them are pretty small, but as we're growing exponentially, those will take off amazingly and create very, very large issues, like being completely naked, so to speak, with your information and being duplicated, essentially, living in the simulation to where you prefer to talk to people through a mobile device or through the computer rather than in person because it's so much easier. And the book talks about those things in what I call digital ethics, which is how to control technology that becomes so infinitely smarter than we are.
You mention in your book a number of potential solutions that could curtail the exponential risks that technology brings. Could you take us through some of those solutions?
Yes, well, I wish there were solutions. They're really kind of recommendations. So there's a whole slew of them. The first one is that we need to have a global debate on why this is important. We need to generate awareness of the topics, right? Why would it be an issue if we use technology to replace human behavior, for example? And a lot of people don't understand this. For example, why is it an issue that Facebook is the largest media company in the world but doesn't have any journalists? And why is it an issue that most people read their news on Facebook, but it's not actually human, right? It's done by an algorithm that wants you to come back, right? Why is that an issue? And so that's awareness, and awareness that computers will eventually, in the near future, become more powerful than us. And of course, not emotionally, but pretty much anything else they will be able to do. Right? And why is it that we're going to unemployment issues, technological unemployment? Why is it an issue? So that's awareness. The second one is creating a global organization that puts down the bottom line on digital ethics. What is okay, what's not okay. For example, not okay would be not using weapons to kill by themselves without human interference. It's bad enough if we use them with human interference, but imagine we would allow drones or if the 4-year-old is a terrorist or not, right? Those kind of things. And then we don't proliferate. We have for nuclear that says if we have machines in 20 years that have an IQ of 500,000, they could proliferate themselves very, very easily and be completely out of. And we wouldn't even know what they're doing and how they're doing it. They would eventually take over our everyday operations, not in the sense of Skynet, but in the sense of just being dominant, right? And so I call this sometimes the EPA for humanity, the Environmental Protection Agency for humanity, essentially fencing humanity and saying we don't want to give this up, we don't want to give up learning languages, we don't want to give up personal contact, we don't, and those things have to be protected. That's just three of them, and then there's many others. Like I believe we should not pursue human-machine cyborg possibilities by default, just because it's possible. We shouldn't allow people to upgrade themselves to be superhuman beyond what we do when they have accidents, or right? That's completely different. But we shouldn't allow people to say, well, I think I will upgrade my thinking by having a second neocortex, and that will make me a better professor. I think that's a bad idea. So I also talk about singularity and transhumanism in the book, which is the two main trends that are sort of trying to get humanity to become technology.
You refer quite a lot to an author called James Barrett, I believe, who describes artificial intelligence as the last invention. Could you take us through that?
Well, there's a lot of concern, and people like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking have amplified the same concern that once we invent a machine that is infinitely smart, it will figure out itself how to become smarter, how to use more processors, right, and how to not get disconnected from the power grid. And it will essentially become something that lives outside of our control, because there's no way we can contain it unless it's contained in a locked up building that's not connected. So if we're not careful, it could invent things that we would not be able to control and would delegate us to a secondary position. Whether it would want to do that or whether it would have any wants, I don't know. I tend to not be that dystopian about this. I think it's largely way too early to discuss machines being that nature. I mean, we have thinking machines today, cognitive computing, but they're not thinking like we are thinking. Right? I mean, it's zeros and ones, right? So it's yes, no, yes, no. Human thinking is embodied, right? It's a completely different cup of tea. And so if we talk about cognitive computing, we're talking about potential of 3-5% of what we can do.
Are you
and that's
referring
already really good, right?
Are you referring to machines like IBM Watson and AlphaGo?
Yeah, and of course there's dozens of others, right? And those machines are impressive, but they're not thinking like you and me are thinking, right? They are thinking in a computer, and that's plenty if they can do that, right? If they can think about which kind of X-ray or MRI would have possible applications for cancer and oncology and stuff, right? That's fantastic. They don't have to think like a doctor, because the doctor thinks with emotions and compassion and hopefully, right? And I mean, it's completely different. So it would be enough if the computer can think like a computer, and I think that should be plenty for us. We don't need those machines to have ethics or emotions, because that's what we do.
You mention in your book the necessity to set up an international digital council for ethics. Are you working on creating that? Would you like to be on that council?
Well, I think I would volunteer, but this is a very difficult scenario, because first of all, we have international bodies like the United Nations and others, and some of that is working, some of it is not working so well. The European Commission is doing lots of great stuff, but then again, they are not really appreciated as a bureaucratic institution, and they, of course, are all very slow. And so I think we need professionals in that, people who only do that, right? And they need to get paid to do it, right? Not like we have today that academics and politicians do this, right? And we need people whose job it is to do this. Right? The other thing is that it's very hard to agree on bottom line ethics, because they're border on lifestyle and beliefs, not so much religion, but the only two countries that don't agree that we should not have weapons that kill people without human supervision are the US and the UK, right? Because they make them. And so imagine we would sit down and would say, well, how far do we go with augmenting humans before they become not human? Right? We will have to find an answer on this, because it's imminent. And for example, how do we educate our children if robots and computers can do all the work? And that's a global issue as well, because imagine countries like China and India, there's going to be hundreds of millions of people unemployed, because these things become available at dirt cheap, and they don't have unions, right? And they don't have any rights. So, yeah, I think I would be delighted to chime in. I think this is something that we really need to think about how that works. The European Commission does have such an ethics commission, right? I think that the flaw there really is that we always expect people to do this just because they are interested in academics, and there's nothing wrong with that, except for that this is a full-time, really responsible gig, right? So in my view, we need to bring in some people between 20 and 40, who get paid good money, like there would be an industry, to do that with us and for us.
Without wanting to put you too much on the spot, if you were given the remit to set up this council, can you give me maybe a few names that you would approach to be on that council, who you would consider to be appropriate guardians of ethics across the world, digital ethics across the world?
Well, I just yesterday had a session at Cybos in Geneva at this financial industry event, and so we had some people that would fit there. Right? So there's Aurélie Pios, she works with the European Commission today. For example, that would be suitable. That's what she does already, right? But in the more political context. And then there's colleagues like Dr. Rashkov who write books on this topic that I would want to draw in. Then I would make sure I would get some people from India and from Brazil involved, of course, on this. Of course, should be international anyway. And some people from industry. I think, for example, IBM's Ginny Rometty would be great to have on this, because she's very much for the complete computerization of society, right? She basically says that what we are is really fancy machines. That's kind of the bottom line. She doesn't put it like that, but so that we have people with disparate opinions, right? And of course, then there's some of the usual people like Elon Musk and those kind of people, but I think ultimately we need to be people who can put down the bottom line in some really tough issues and get to the point to where all governments could agree that this is not what we're going to do. And for example, it will become possible to engineer our genetics to avoid diseases. Roughly, that depends on what you're talking about. Diabetes is soon, but otherwise 15, 20 years. If we can do that, then we can also program our babies, right? And we can say, well, I don't have cancer, but I really would like to be fitter for running, So we figure out how that works, and then we program ourselves. So those issues need to be decided upon. If we can do that, would it be free? And if it's free, would everybody do whatever they want, including living for 1,000 years? Right? And who's in charge of that? Right? And even if we don't have a solution, the discussion alone would crystallize the thinking. Right? So a lot of times I think the Ethics Council wouldn't necessarily say allowed or not allowed. It would say that this is something we really have to keep an eye on, because it's not just do it. Right? And I think the problem really is that the technology industries are the most powerful industries in the world now, and they're getting to be more powerful by the minute. It used to be banking and oil, now it's technology and data. Right? And if we say that whatever they invent, they effectively become mission control for humanity. Right? They will shape and control our lives beyond recognition, because it makes both loads of money. Right? I think that's a bad idea.
You're a futurologist and also a nowist. What does it take to do those two things? Do you have to, as Leonardo da Vinci was, be a polymath?
I think it would be helpful if you could be that. It's not something that you can just say that you want to be. That's like saying as a guitar player you want to be Jimi Hendrix. That's not quite as simple as that. I think it's helpful if you learn how to do these things and understand many different things, and if you have a talent for that, even though I believe that it's highly practicable. The thing is, my work is more of a, that's why I say it's about nowism, because really these issues exist today, but they're on my screen just a little bit earlier before they're on other people's screen, right? So sometimes I say the future is actually not what's going to happen tomorrow, is what already has happened today that we've missed. Right? And this is already all here. If you don't believe that we can connect our brain to the internet, then you haven't been observing what's happening. Right? And yes, it's a question of how long that will be, but it will happen. So I think the skills of seeing that are practicable, but it takes a certain amount of tenacity to look at thousands of sources and talk to people, and we'll have more people with that job in the future, I think.
You have an agency of futurists, 40 futurists, I believe, across the world. How have you chosen them?
Well, they're colleagues that I've seen speaking and that have written books, and many of them are people that I work with on a regular basis. So it's really about personal relationships. So when somebody's asking me to do a future session for a board of directors or so, right, you have to make sure you have the right person, the right knowledge, the right attitude, and so that's how they've been chosen. But there are hundreds more that are not listed. This is just a global network of people who are suitable for certain types of future work, right? So speaking, video, we do lots of films as well now too. CEO coaching, which we do a lot. So it's a very personal thing, and ultimately the value of what we do has to be on a personal level. Changing your settings, right? Rearranging the mental furniture, as we say, right? and that's where everything comes from. It's actually not about the intellectual process. There's plenty of information about this, right? But people don't believe it, or they don't read it, or they don't understand it, and they certainly haven't emotionally taken it in. So that is the main challenge.
You've worked a great deal in the music industry, been an entrepreneur in that industry. When did your interest in becoming a futurologist occur? When did it first happen?
Well, I think I was already a futurist as an entrepreneur, because for me the future was already here. I mean, we started in 1996 doing digital music, and for me it was totally clear that music is moving to the cloud. But of course that was before the iPhone, before streaming, and it was real networks back then. Right? And it was clear to me that I was always at least 5 or 10 years too early in my business concept. I thought it was going to happen in 2 years, So we started something like Spotify in 1997. And then I wrote a book about music like water, which is Spotify. So it's very hard to be an entrepreneur and be too early because you have to wait, right? And then it costs lots of money to wait. So that really became apparent when I wrote the book, The Future of Music, my first book in 2004. And everything we said in the book, I wrote with Dave Cusack, a colleague. Everything in the book has become reality. But it was obvious, right? But it has become reality. So I realized I had the skill of seeing things a little bit earlier. And it was better for me to actually talk about that rather than to try to realize that by creating startups. And it's been a good model. My clients kind of pick up those ideas and then they go off with them or not, right? That's a much better model.
I'm interested in looking at your journey to reaching this point. Can you talk to me about your childhood? What sort of child were you?
Well, I was always very interested in the future, even as a child. Basically, my teachers always said I had too much imagination. And so I was always looking, well, I loved history, but also loved going forward from the history. And then I was a student of theology and philosophy. That was kind of an aberration. I was looking to become a Lutheran minister.
Why did you not?
Well, it was in Germany. That's more like high-level social work. It's not like you are. I mean, there's all different options there that you can take. But basically, I was interested in the humanistic part, so I studied really hard for 5 years and all of the philosophy and all these things. I was much more interested in the people rather than the religion.
Which makes you very well placed to raise this issue of technology versus humanity.
Yeah, because I studied that, and then I studied music, which is humanity, of course, right? And then I was in the tech business for 12 years doing internet startups, right? And all of my clients are tech clients, for a long time. So I see both sides of the table. I'm quite geeky, but I'm not tech in that sense, My good friends that are tech people would have a good laugh if I thought I was techie, right? It's just sort of a parallel thing, right? So I've always been interested in asking questions, right? And the most important thing that if you want to know about the future, you have to be able to ask questions and ask the question why we do that, right? Because I think the key issue right now with technology is that technology can do pretty much anything. In 20 years, there's not going to be anything that we can't do. Right? We want to harness space energy by flying something up there. We can do that. We can go to Mars. We can do all. But the real question is ultimately going to be why, and does it serve human purpose, or is it a great business? Sometimes it can be the same, right? But in general, that is going to be the key question, right? Is it going to be a good thing for us to do this? even if we can do it, should we do it?
What's your earliest memory of technology?
Well, as a musician, of course, you're always very close to technology. So when I started playing music when I was around 10, and then I started fiddling with the electric guitar and became very techy, right? So you have all these stomp boxes and the effects, and you can twiddle knobs, and I was very much into seeing what happens when I do this, right? And then I got very heavily into the internet because I realized that this was the vehicle for people to communicate and to go direct, right? And that's when I got interested in programming. I don't program, but I got interested in understanding technology. So I grew up in the forest. My father was a forester. Right? So it's not technology at all, it's nature. Right? So those two components are still very strong in my work, nature, humanities, and technology. And I think that's a good mix.
Do you have any brothers and sisters?
I have a brother, yeah, he lives in Berlin. Yeah.
And does he work in technology?
No, he's doing management stuff. He's a business guy.
During the course of your childhood and early university years, did you receive specific mentoring or encouragement from teachers that you remember?
Well, that's a long story. But as a university student in Bonn, in Germany, I studied philosophy. Was very open. The way that universities are in Germany, you can go or you cannot go. It's basically up to you. It was a good system for me to just explore stuff. But when I went to Berklee College, the music school in Boston, it was much more regimented, much more tight. Much more pressure, and American school system is pretty demanding. I did get great feedback from my teachers there, about music, really, primarily. But then when I started doing the startups, that's when I learned the most. So I had people that helped me work out what I should do and how business planning goes, and people who were my mentors then, like my first investor, Michael Tannen, who was John Lennon's lawyer, or still is, I think. People like that. So I've met lots of people who would, help me along figuring out what to do.
I think at university you studied guitar composition, is that correct?
Yeah, well, music in general sense. Berklee College in Boston, right? So that was 1986, a long time ago. So I started guitar and performance and, of course, music in general.
Do you still do that?
Well, I did it for 15 years, and then I kind of felt like I'd done my thing, and I wasn't really good enough to get to a level to where I could enjoy the future. There's really only a couple of hundred famous, well-known musicians, not those that we know, the major brands, but those supporting them. So I have many of my friends who play with famous musicians, and I just couldn't get to that level, and I got bored playing nightclubs in Las Vegas or cruise ships and stuff, right? And I made lots of records. It was a good time, but then the internet came, and I was swept away by this possibility.
Who has influenced you most in your life?
Oh, there are a lot of people. I mean, you should see my Kindle queue. There's like 280 people that I'm reading. But I think the biggest influence, of course, in my early part were the ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates and people who talked about essentially why things make sense. Right? And then the big German writers, Hermann Hesse and all these people that you read in college, when you go to college in Germany. And then musically speaking, of course, all the great jazz artists like Miles Davis and those kind of things, those kind of people that I try to emulate somehow. Right? And then, more recently, probably people like Richard Branson that I admire for how he does things. Right? And then also more spiritual stuff like Dalai Lama and those kind of people with their philosophies. And so there's lots of people. I take it pretty much from all directions, like a giant remix,
And what about people you know on a personal level?
Well, of course, there's my wife, who's a body awareness Feldenkrais practitioner. who work with the body. I work with the mind, you know. Well, mostly really. So that's a good match, right? And then, of course, when you have kids, it's always good to have kids because they bring you back to the bottom line, right? Rather than going off into the sky and how to change the universe, right? So, yeah, it's with a lot of people.
You've met many people during the course of your career so far, and are meeting an awful lot of people promoting your new book, Technology versus Humanity, Gerd. Who is on your list? Who would you most like to meet that you would not ordinarily come into contact with during the course of your working day social life? And what question would you like to ask them?
Well, again, there's a lot of people on this list, but I think the primary person I would like to meet would be President Obama. Now that he's no longer going to be president, would be an interesting conversation. And my question to him would be, what would you really like to do to make a difference? Because obviously he's tried, you know, but I'm not sure that's even possible. Being the president of the U.S. is to make more difference than he did. But it's a complicated question. But I think he has the potential to do that, maybe now that he's unlocked, you know. I think that the topic of the future is something that keeps coming up in his speeches, and so that would be an interesting conversation.
As a final point, could you summarize the key risks that your book highlights and what the solutions are, the suggestions that your book makes, and the sort of phone calls that you would like after this interview?
Yeah, maybe I haven't thought quite that far. You know, the book is really a work in progress because these are very complicated topics. I mean, if you take the topic, for example, of happiness, right? We all know that technology does not make happy. Even though technology keeps saying that it makes happy, right? Because it's magic, right? It does make you happy to be able to talk to your son in South Africa through WhatsApp for free. But it's a different kind of happiness than building a relationship with your son, right? So that's one of the main dangers, is that we confuse what technology does with what actually matters to us, right? And sometimes there's lots of overlap, right? But for example, simulating happiness, like on Facebook, right? This kind of pleasure trap, right? It has its own purpose. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but if we believe that this is the thing, you know, that's when we get into trouble. So, for example, if I use a translation device to talk to a Japanese sushi chef about sushi, right, that's meaningful and it's interesting. It's a nice tool. But if I build a relationship with a Japanese woman that I want to marry, and then all we do is talk through that box to each other, right, that would not be a good thing because it's intermediated, right? It's not the same relationship, right? So the biggest problem, I think, of technology is that technology will start to simulate things that are extremely convenient and quick and fast and cheap and very addictive. You know, augmented reality, virtual reality, holograms, time-space simulations, direct connections to the internet, brain-computer interfaces. You can only imagine how convenient that would be if you become God, essentially, through technology. Well, I'm not religious, but this is kind of like what in the end will happen, right, is that we have God-like power. We have one person connected to that web like this, directing all of the network traffic for a major telecom or something. You know, it's possible, right? So, however, on a personal level, you know, this could be getting to the point to where it becomes like the strongest drug we've ever known. Because it makes us feel like we're limitless, you know. We are omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, and we lose the things that make us human. For example, mistakes, risks, mysteries, compassion, understanding, creativity, design. You know, the list.
Serendipity.
Yeah, the list goes on forever. So what we do is we use technology to make things more convenient, and we cut off things in the process that we actually need. Like in the dating process, you can use Tinder. That's not really dating, but you know, okay, it furthers the kind of same direction, right? And you know it works. You get to the goal quickly, but it's not the same than dating at all. Right? It's a wormhole, right? I'm not saying it's a bad thing. People can do whatever they want to do with this. But if this becomes the new normal, then we have to worry about what we're actually doing. Right? That's like saying you can have relationships with machines. And that's what tech companies want, right? They want us to have a relationship with the machine. Not overtly, but it's useful, right? So those are some of the biggest dangers. Abdication, being able to say, okay, I don't know how this works. The machine does it for me, like Google Maps. In that case, it's not a bad thing because we can probably live without that, right? And we can probably live without driving a car. That's not really innately human, right? So the car will drive itself, not a big deal. Right? But if we then say, let the machine decide if we're going to have this baby or not, right? Based on what it may look like. Right? That I think then we're getting to the point where we say that is really our business, right? It's not the machine's business. And even though it would be efficient, it would not be human. Right? So we should not put efficiency over humanity. And that's what machines do. That's all they know. Right? So the biggest issue that is really compounded in the book is the issue of saying that we give machines this huge authority over us, right? And at what point does it become reducing our humanity? Right? So in an ideal world, would have very powerful technology, and then humanity would sit on top of it. Right? So we would have what I call exponential humanism on top of exponential technology. But it would require that we accept our limitations, that we don't become like technology. Because if we become like technology, then we become useless because we're bad technology. We need sleep. We need all these things that's completely irrational and inefficient. Right? We could never compete. Why would we want to compete? And I think that's ultimately the discussion of the book, is that we need guidance on this and stewardship. And so the phone calls I would like to have afterward is from the people who currently are those leaders and stewards, right? And of course, that is to a large degree politicians and people who are in charge of policy, leaders, some of them industry leaders, right? But also I would like calls from major CEOs of companies that are saying, how can we be responsible in our technology? Right? Because, this is a major topic now, is that every tech company wants to be human. Right? But imagine the challenge. I mean, it's almost impossible to sell humanity. I mean, how do you make money with humanity, right? It's just not a very good business model. You sell stuff, right? Or software, or, it's a very difficult dilemma for companies to say that they care about people or about humanity, because that's not a product. Right? It's not something you stuff in a box and ship. Right? Mm-hmm. So I'd like calls from those people saying, well, how do we integrate this into our policy? For example, if you can automate 90% of your company's interactions, like in telecom, do you pay an automation tax? Right? Do you volunteer to take half of that increased margin and put it into a pot to help those people that are no longer there? And if you wanted it, how would you help them? Right? Those are all complicated questions. Right? Are you responsible? And I think that these new oil companies, the technology companies, they are the most powerful companies in the world. They have to be responsible for what they do. They have to be just as responsible as the oil companies were. Well, at least we tried to get them to be responsible, but because these are extremely powerful things, right? And so if they don't collaborate with those that lead our countries and the world, then we're in deep trouble, right? Because that will grow exponentially. And the stuff that looks very small today, like people getting sucked into technology and getting addicted to using technology rather than using themselves. Right? Sometimes I like to say, it's abundance outside and scarcity inside, right? So I can do anything I want on the outside using devices and technology, but I know nothing about myself, right? I have no ethics, I have no norms, I have no understanding, I'm just all on the outside, right? That's a major problem, and technology is encouraging that.
One final question before we go. You mentioned Facebook quite a lot during the course of the book. If you were made the CEO of Facebook tomorrow, what would you change?
Well, I think the boldest move, and I've discussed with many of my friends, is to say, what, Facebook is really a company that is a vehicle for what we do with each other, right? And therefore, it should not sell ads. It should not be on the stock market. Right? It should be paid for by the members. Because if we pay for this, right, then we can decide what we want. We wouldn't have outside interference. The problem with Facebook has now is that it's pretending to be for us, but it's really for its own purpose, right? And that purpose is to make money, right? And if you're on the stock market, that is the purpose. Until we have a better stock market, that is the purpose, right? So it's really a cheat. It's a gigantic cheat, right? And we can't escape, because if we get out, then our traffic dwindles down. Like I got off Facebook for 3 months, my traffic went down 70%, right? So now I'm back, right? And so what I would do is I would say, look, pay us $10 a year. We don't do all the stuff we do now, the data mining, the monitoring, the surveillance, we just make it all yours. That's what I do.
Thank you very much. Gerd Leonhard, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and all the best with promoting your book, Technology versus Humanity. You're already achieving your objective of raising the debate in this whole area, and I've certainly found it fascinating read.
Great, thank you very much for your time. Okay, take care.
Thanks a lot, and it would be really interesting to catch up with you maybe a year down the line and see what's happening, see if you are heading up this worldwide digital council.
If I am, you'll find out about it.
I hope so. I hope I'll be one of the first to hear.
I'll keep you posted. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thanks a lot.
See you.